Before we start this video, a large thank you to Nick, Yuhi, Andre, Brian, and NBoss for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner and Kino for their continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, gentlemen, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, we're going to continue with range now today and make it so we can actually load a projectile into our hands. So let's go to the weapon action script. Let's create a new C# script, and I'm going to call this fire projectile weapon item action. Or fire projectile action, whatever you prefer. Let's double click this, go into it, delete our start and update functionality as is per tradition, drop in our namespace. And I'm going to make this derive from the base class so it gets the actual attempt perform action, which is going to be weapon item action. Now I'm going to go to the light attack weapon action and just copy this create asset menu, so I'll just type that again, and I'll change light attack into fire projectile. So let's outline what we're going to do in this script before we actually do it, so we have a clear path and a direction we're going to follow. First, let's override the attempt perform action, and let's put in our two checks, which is going to be stamina, and if you're performing an action, return. And now we can discuss through these pseudo comments what we're going to do. So 1, define which projectiles we are using, the main hand slot or the secondary slot. So we're going to have to make an enum for that. 2, if the projectile is null, we want to return, don't go any further for whatever reason. 3, if the player is not two-handing the weapon, let's make them two-handed now, because you need to be two-handing the bow to fire it. Weapons must be two-handed to fire projectiles. And then number 4, if the player does not have an arrow notched, do so now. And this is the bulk of what we're going to do in this video, so let's get to it. Go to enums, and wherever you want to put it, just make an enum for, I'm going to call this projectile slot. That's a good name. So main slot or secondary slot are the options. So you can call it main projectile slot and secondary projectile slot, or you can just call it main and secondary because the variable name projectile slot will be before this every time, so it's kind of plainly clear what this is. So I'm just going to call mine main and secondary. Alright, cool. Save that. Go back over to fire projectile action and make a local variable up top here. So not a local variable, a variable in the script for projectile slot, because we're going to make 2 of these. One's going to be for the main, one's going to be for the second. And you will put the main slot in your right bumper action and your secondary slot in your right trigger action, which lets you to fire 2 different kinds of arrows. So do a switch, and then for the switch statement, all we're going to do is fetch a ranged projectile item. Call it projectile or whatever you want to call it, and if it's in the main slot, we search the main projectile inventory slot, and if it's in the secondary, we search the secondary. Now, that doesn't exist yet, so let's go make it. Go to your player inventory manager, wherever you want, add a header for projectiles. I'm going to put mine right below armor. So header, projectiles, and you want to make a public ranged projectile item variable. I'm going to call this one main projectile, and then do the same thing for your secondary, call it secondary projectile. And there we go. That's a very simple way to switch between the two. So right now there's no way to actually get these with network variables right now. So if they change, it's only local, but we're gonna handle that in just a moment. We'll get through this bit of it first. So main projectile item is equal to player performing action dot player inventory manager dot main projectile. And secondary is the same thing, except you would search the secondary projectile instead of the main. Alright, cool. So now we have a way to get our projectiles. Now there's only going to be 2 slots. If you're doing it like Elden Ring, if you want to add more, go for it. You'll need to add more real estate to the buttons. So with right now right bumper and right trigger, we have 2 that we have open that we can use to fire projectiles. So doing more than 2 might be a little more complex. So if we have our projectile item equal to null, simply return. If the player is not two-handing the weapon, make them two-handed now. So if player performing action is owner, we're just going to say if player performing action dot player network manager dot is not two-handing weapon dot value. Then we're going to simply check if we're using the right or left hand, and if we're using the right hand, we're going to two-hand the right weapon. And if we're using the left hand, we're going to two-hand the left weapon. So if player.performing action.player network manager is using right hand, and then you do that, so that would be the two-handing the right weapon. Otherwise, we are going to two-hand the left weapon. So what are we going to do from here? Well, after we two-hand it, then we need to check if the player has an arrow notched. And so we're going to make a network variable for that. And if they don't have an arrow notched, we're going to notch an arrow. So I'm doing all this code now for the bow. In the future, when we do crossbows, we're going to modify it a little bit because you don't have to hold a crossbow bolt, but you do have to hold an arrow for it not to fire. So player performing action player network manager is two-handing left weapon value equals true. That's accidentally in the wrong spot. I'll put this down here. The top one is two-handing right weapon is equal to true. All right, cool. Looks good. Now, let's save that. Let's go back up to the top here. Just checking our projectiles. Okay, so jump over to Player Network Manager and go down. I'm going to put mine probably under Armor. Make a new header for projectiles. And now we're going to make these projectiles have a network ID. We're going to make it so when you change the network ID, you change the projectiles that are in the main and secondary slot. So copy any ID variable here. I'm going to copy one of the equipment ones and change it to main projectile ID. Copy and paste that. Change it to secondary projectile ID. Cool, simple enough. Now we can go down to where we have all of our functions. You can see here we have set or on current left weapon, right weapon changed, and on current spell changed. I'm going to copy on current spell ID changed and change that to on main projectile ID changed. I'm going to change the spell item variable to a ranged projectile item. I'm going to right click and rename new spell to new projectile, and I'm going to get a projectile from the list in our world item database by referencing get projectile by ID. I'm then going to set the main projectile in the player.player inventory manager to the new projectile if it is found, and I'm going to erase this update UI method because there is no HUD to update for the projectiles being swapped out. So I'm going to copy this and do the same thing for secondary. So this is going to be on secondary projectile ID change. And now that I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that I have made a mistake, and I'm actually accidentally looking in the spell world item database before I instantiate it from the projectile item database. So I'm going to fix that real fast too. So this should be get projectile by ID, not get spell by ID. There we go. Easy to miss, especially when it doesn't give you an error. All right, so now that we have these two set up, what we need to do is go and call these on on-network spawn and on-network despawns. Let's go ahead and do that. Jump over to the player manager now, right here. Let's go down to on-network spawn. I'm going to place mine below my equipment under the same comment. So player network manager dot main projectile ID dot on value changed plus equals player network manager dot on main projectile changed. And then do the same thing with secondary. And then we can copy both of these, and we can go down to on-network despawn and unsubscribe from these events. All right, looks good. Copy that. Scroll down here and paste this here. Minus, minus. All right, cool. What's next? All right, come down to load other player character. That way when you load them into the game, you also load the projectiles, same as before, because remember this only calls when the value changes. So if you join a game and the value is already changed when you weren't here, you won't load the new projectiles. So we call this function when we load into a game, we load everyone's character. We're just going to make sure they load their projectiles as well by calling player network manager on main projectile changed and on secondary projectile changed. You want to pass the main projectile ID and then the secondary projectile ID for those functions. All right, cool. Save that. Go back over to the player network manager. Let's add a new bool network variable. It's going to be has arrow notched. This is going to be used for the bow. Has arrow notch. Cool. So right now, don't worry about it. It will be more important in a bit. We just need to make sure we're keeping track of when it is notched, which is right here on the fire projectile action. We're going to check if we do already have one notched. So if player performing action dot player network manager does not have an arrow notched, then we can proceed by notching an arrow. So we're going to say has arrow notch dot value. What are we going to do? Well, we need to check for ownership again. So what we're going to do is make the code a little bit simpler. We're going to copy everything inside the original with owner and paste it below it. And then I'm going to change this to if we're not the owner, simply return. Because everything below here is going to be ran only if you're the owner. And this is only important also if you're running these weapon actions through a server RPC. If you're doing it like me, you probably aren't. I'm just coding it in case you are because it doesn't hurt to in case you want to do it that way. So this might not be even important to you if you're following the tutorial normally. If the player performing action .player network manager does not have an arrow notched, we're going to make a bool for can I draw a projectile. And then we're going to check to see if the projectile has any ammunition to begin with. So what did I call that? Current, was it current ammo? Yes, current ammo amount. If current ammo amount is less than or equal to 0, we're going to simply return. We cannot do that. Or you can play a funny animation, which I will include in the description of this video. If you are a patron or if you have the bow animation set, this is going to go on in the future. But if you want it right now, just drop me a message on Patreon. I'll send it to you, or at me, or email me. Here it is. It is an animation that just simply basically makes you reach for an item, and then you kind of look around because you can't find it. So I'm going to call this out of ammo. And the benefit of this is it punishes the player if they try to fire when they don't have any ammunition. It comes at a cost if you're not paying attention. I quite like this. So you can't mindlessly just spam the right bumper button trying to shoot arrows as fast as possible. Alright, so I'm going to play out of ammo, and then I'm going to say true, and then return. Okay, so looks good. Save that. Let's make a function here called private bool. Can I fire this, or can I draw this projectile? Probably a better name. This is going to check to see if you can actually even load a projectile. Why is this important? Well, what if you have bolts in your projectile slot and you're using a bow? You can't fire those with a bow. So we only have one item type right now, so I'm always going to return true. But if you were to say have great bows and great arrows, you can only fire a great arrow with a great bow. So you're going to compare your weapon performing actions item class against the range projectile items arrow class. And you just basically want to set up here whatever you want to be able to fire what kind of ammunition. But we only have one, which is a bow and an arrow. So for now, I'm simply going to return true because it's always going to be true. But the comment here, check for crossbow, great bow, etc. Compare the ammo to get the result. Can you fire this? If so, return true. If not, return false. Simple stuff. All right, back to attempt to perform action. Right below that now, I am actually going to say, can I draw a projectile is equal to, can I fire this projectile? Then we're going to pass the weapon performing the action and the projectile item we got from either the main or the secondary slot. Now, if you can't, we're just going to simply return. So, if I cannot draw this projectile, return. And I'm going to copy this and put this above here because we can do that check first before we check for ammo count. It doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to check for it first. Alright, if you pass all these checks, what's next? Well, you want to play the loading your projectile animation, which will basically draw arrows, which will send a server RPC and play it on your character model in other people's games. But also, we want to send a server RPC so we actually cause our bow to load and the arrow to instantiate on our game object in everybody else's game. So we would say player network manager dot notify server. I'm just going to copy one and change the name. Notify server of, what do you call this? Drawn projectile server RPC. Cool. And we're going to make it require, honestly, all it needs to require is the arrow item ID. In Nephilim, I see I'm referencing the owner client ID, but I think that's for a different reason. I'm going to write it down right now, but I know that I don't need this, so we're probably going to end up deleting it. All right, so jump over to the player network manager. Let's make the server RPC. Nephilim's is a little bit different, which is what I reference most of my code for in this project. Nephilim's, I don't actually hold the right bumper button. I tap it to load it and tap it to fire it. I might change that in the future if I like this more, but we're going to do it like Elden Ring does it. So you get a hold right bumper to load the arrow, releasing it fires the arrow. So notify the server of drawn projectile server RPC. Sounds good. And we're going to rename this to projectile ID. All right, cool. Now if we are the server, we obviously want to play a client RPC. Let's delete that. We just need the projectile item ID. That's it. You don't need the client or network object of the character. Okay, let's copy and paste this name because apparently I spelled it wrong over here. Notify the server. Okay, I'm going to rename that. I don't like that. Just notify server is fine. Let's erase that. Save. Let's go over here now. Server RPC changes to client RPC. Then we got public void to private void. And server RPC to client RPC. Okay, so what are we doing here? Well, we're basically going to make it so this loads up the bow, instantiates our arrow, and makes our bow play an animation. Because our player is already playing the animation back when we call that initial server RPC. Whoops. I erased it. No, we're not. Let me call that back in. So player performing action dot player animator manager play target action animation load. Did I call that load projectile 01? Make sure you say true. We want to lock ourselves in this animation. All right, now we're good. So let's go over here now. We're going to run this on everybody's game, including our own, because this is how we're going to load our arrow to and make our bow animate. So notify the server of drawn projectile client RPC past the projectile ID. Now, what are we doing here? Well, let's get the animator for the bow. The bow animator is going to be a child object of the bow model that's either in our left or right hand. So how do we discern where it is? Well, we know if we're two-handing our left weapon, it's got to be in our left model's hand. Otherwise, the only thing left is right, so it's got to be in our right model's hand. So that's how we're going to get it. So if is two-handing left weapon value, else, then it's in this other place. So we're going to say bow animator is equal to player.player equipment manager dot left weapon slots, left weapon model, sorry, dot get component in children animator. Okay, otherwise copy and paste that. It's the exact same thing except it's on the right hand. Cool. Alright, so we have the bow animator. What's next? We're going to make it play in animation. So all we got to do here is say bow animator dot set bool. This doesn't exist yet. Don't worry, we don't have a bow controller yet. Is drawn, set it to true. And then we're going to make it play the draw animation by saying bow animator play bow underscore 2hand underscore draw underscore 01. I'm just going to call it bow draw 01 to be honest. Okay, cool. So I'll make a comment right here, animate the bow. Now, after we have the bow animated, we simply instantiate the warm-up projectile arrow. So, instantiate the arrow. How do we do that? Well, we know there is a warm-up projectile variable on our item, or our range projectile. So we get the arrow by saying GameObject arrow is equal to instantiate. And we instantiate this from going to the world item database.instance. And then we say .get range projectile by ID. And we pass the projectile ID we need for this client RPC. And then we say dot. And then I can't remember what I called the variables. Let me check that real fast. I called it, let's see, it's over the script. Draw projectile model. Okay, that's a good name. Go back to this, put in the draw projectile model. Now, wherever you want to put this, see, in Nephilim, I put this on the prop bone. So it handles the animation for me and orients the arrow where it's supposed to. But since we don't have a prop bone, we're going to put it in our offhand. And then we're going to make a weapon pivot for the arrow, just like our weapons. So it looks nice when it's in your hand. This is the bonus having a prop bone. All the animator can do that for you, and all you gotta do is put it in there and not worry about the values. But when you don't have a prop bone, you have to make these weapon pivots for all these objects, which isn't a big deal, but that's why I like using prop bones. Player.player effects manager. You can see here we have a warm-up spell effect. Now we need to make one for a warm-up projectile effect. Now you could use the warm-up spell effect, quite honestly. It probably would make a difference, but I'm going to make one for the arrow in case you want some special logic for the arrow in the future. We will have special logic for a bolt, for example, because when you roll or get broken out of a damage animation, your bolt won't disappear, whereas your arrow will, because you have to hold it. The bolt stays loaded in the crossbow. So active drawn projectile effects is a good name. So we're going to say the active drawn projectile effects is equal to the arrow. Now, let's locate where we delete all these effects. Destroy all current action effects client RPC. This is on the character network manager, by the way. Now, if you have the active drawn projectile effects not equaling null, destroy it, just like you do the spell effects. Now, we're going to come back and kind of put this in a couple places in the very distant future, potentially aside from here, depending on how we handle more projectiles, but for now, this is fine. Let's go to our bow, our actual prefab, like our model that's in the weapon. Go down to where you see the animator, and you can see it's empty. There's no controller. Let's create a new animator controller. I'm going to call it bow object. Make sure you're not mixing up the bow object animator controller from the demo scene in the bow package, if that's what you're using, by the way. So I'm going to make a new one here, and I'm going to make an empty state. I'm just going to call this empty. And this is the animator controller we're going to put in the bow. So I'm going to drag that in right now. All right, we just need 3 animations. And now if you're watching this video, make sure you put in the isDrawn animator parameter, but also if you have the bow animation set, I've just noticed that these aren't in individual FBX files, this draw animation, the fire animation, and the aim animation. So what you want to do is Control D on them all and duplicate them so they're individual animation files. But the next time I update the bow package, I guess this one slipped between the cracks, I will make these as individual FBX files and not all one. So this is called bow object anim right now. Next time it'll be bow object aim, bow object default, bow object fire, etc., etc. But don't worry about that for now. Set up all the animation states. So bow fire goes back to bow empty. Bow draw goes to bow aim whenever it's done. And bow empty goes to bow aim if isDrawn is true. And then bow aim goes to empty if isDrawn is false. And you can untick as exit time. And that's it. It'll be pretty straightforward. There's nothing else really to it. So I am going to duplicate these animations though, and basically assign them as individual animations instead of referencing them all from the FBX, just because I kind of like doing it that way. You can then tick loop time here if you want to, so the aim is going to be looped, but you can have it unticked on the other ones, so we're going to go ahead and do that. And transition looks fine. Okay, cool, so now I'll duplicate draw, and I'll duplicate aim, was it? No, fire, sorry. And I'll drag these in as I need to. So they're not looped, cool. Drag this in here, and just drag this in here. All right, looks good. Now, let's save that prefab, get back out of here, go into the game and drag in the arrow model, and you're going to have to make a pivot for this. So I'm going to call this drawn underscore standard arrow underscore 01. Now, we actually didn't put in our fire projectile item action yet in the game, so I'm going to go ahead and make that. So create character actions, weapon actions, and then we're going to say fire projectile action. Now, if you are firing these actions with server RPCs, you're probably not if you're following the tutorial to follow. You're definitely not. Drag this in your world action manager. If not, you don't really need to worry about it, but I'm going to drag it there just to keep it concise. So I am going to duplicate this now and make one for secondary and make one for main. So basically make the projectile slot on one, main, and make the other one secondary. And then also drag that in the world action manager if you want. So just to iterate again, main will be when you press right bumper and it will fire your main arrows. And then secondary will be you press right trigger and it fires your secondary arrows. So main, primary arrows, and then your secondary arrows. So right bumper action, fire main, right trigger action, fire secondary. Now I'm going to drag these in the bow now. There we go. All right, going to go put my standard arrow in, and I didn't put a pivot on it yet, so it's probably kind of messed up. Make sure you got your draw animation there, and I didn't call mine the same thing I did in the project. What is it? I called it in here. Okay, so I'm just going to change the name. There we go. So I have my arrow here, and you can see it's doing this. So what you want to do, you can see the bow is a little bit off too, is you want to take the arrow, create an empty parent, and then you want to call this parent pivot and then reset the arrow's transform, just like you do with the weapons. Basically, make sure the arrow is positioned nicely in the hands and it lines up with the edge of the bow. If you want how it's exactly supposed to look, you can check the demo scene and just copy the exact transforms as they are in the model. Those transforms in the model in the demo scene are literally taken from the prop bones. They would look how they would actually look in Nephilim. I'm not going to do that though, because again, I'm just iterating the logic here to you right now. I'm not going to stress out too much about the exactness of it. I'll get it looking nice, but I won't go copy it directly from the actual demo scene in there. But if you want to do that, I encourage you and recommend it, because that's how it is meant to look from Rob's point of view, and he's the animator. So paste your pivot when you get this done. I might have accidentally used the wrong prefab. I think I took the prefab from the demo scene on accident. We'll figure out real soon if I did that. So let's see. I'm going to overwrite this prefab and drag this in here. Let's go into the scene and see if I... Alright, so yes, I did. Absolutely. This is terrible. Okay, one more time. Back in here, standard arrow. Load it again. Here we go. That looks good. Excellent. So you can see now the bow is a little bit off. So what you do here now is go to your bow and then change the bow weapon pivot and make it so you line up the string with your fingers. And that's how you know if the bow is in the right place. Again, if you copy the pivot from the demo scene, you won't need to do this. But if you did, there we go. Rotate it back and tilt it up. And you may need to play it this a little bit. You can see now it's almost out of the hand a little bit. So just keep messing around until it looks nice. I won't spend too much time on this on video. I'll do this off video and get it looking nice, because if not, you're just going to be watching me adjust rotations for 5 minutes. And once you got that in a good place, copy the component, paste it. Now, back in the scene again. Boom, there's our arrow. And there we go. It rests relatively nicely. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about shooting the arrow and the multiple ways to do that. So when you fire the arrow, you can fire it using... aimed or unaimed or locked on, all which have a little bit of a different logic to them. So we're going to talk about how we're going to do all of those, and we're going to talk about actually tilting the character up and down to match where you're looking with the arrow. Now this is something that Elden Ring and Dark Souls does with attacks too, and we're going to do this in a separate video because it is a little bit more complex. But if you want to go ahead and try it on your own right now, there are a couple ways to do it. If you want to write your own code, what you would do is you would basically manipulate the bones in late update, changing the rotations, so it happens after the animations process their movements and transform rotations. Or you could use Unity's animation rigging tool, I believe it's called, to put a position where you're going to aim and make the character look towards that. Or optionally, there is a very cool package on the Unity Asset Store, I believe it's called Final IK. So doing it yourself, you're going to manipulate the transforms and rotations in late update is the way I would do it and have done it in the past. But we will discuss that in a future video. For now, thank you very much for joining me this weekend. I hope you all have a very lovely weekend. A special thank you to my patrons. It is because of each and every one of you I get to keep doing this. You have my sincerest gratitude. All right, I will see you guys next week.